and Senate last year. It allows folks to get career and technical education if they are high school graduates or if they have graduated from high school and are unemployed and are needing to get the skills that they need to be gainfully employed within our state. So is there any opposition to the introduction of this bill? Seeing none, we will accept that. The next, I'm sorry, I do need to give you an RS number. It's RS 0259. So the next bill I would like to introduce is RS 0306. That is the Foster Care Children's Report Card. That is a bill that was passed by not only the Senate, but also the House. The governor did veto that bill, and then a month later introduced it as an executive order. And so that is being brought forth so that regardless of who is in the second floor executive office, that will continue to be a law within our state. Are there any questions or opposition about the Foster Care Children Report Card? Yes, Senator Petty.
Could you just say that RS number again, please?
Yes, it is RS 0306.
Thank you.
Seeing no questions or any opposition, we will move that forward. The next bill introduction I have is RS 0426, and that is the ACT Work Keys bill. And that is to allow, again, it was passed by the House and the Senate and vetoed by the governor, but that is to allow all Kansas high school kids to take the ACT, the pre-ACT, and the Work Keys testing without charge. So the pre-ACT is administered the freshman year, the ACT and the Work Keys is administered the junior year. And ACT is making that available for one cost, and the state does pay for that. Do I have any questions or opposition to the introduction of that? Seeing none, the last bill introduction I have is RS 0257, and that is the school vision screenings. That is a request that has been made by, we've had a hearing on it for 2 years, and it was passed out of committee this last year and voted on by the Senate. And that, I'm trying to think of the organization that had requested that. I'm sorry, but I can't remember, but they did request it again for this year. Are there any questions about that particular bill? So I will ask again, now that we have some more people in the room, are there any other bill introductions? Okay, Julie Hine, I understand you're with us on WebEx.
I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, speak it. Just to use your outside voice.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair and committee members. This is Julie Hine with Hine Governmental Consulting, representing Cleveland University. We are requesting a committee bill for RS number 0180. This is identical to Senate Bill 277 that the committee worked last year. It was passed on the consent calendar, dealing with a clarification in statute, actually 2 clarifications in the statute regarding Cleveland University, Kansas City campus.
Eddie, are there any questions? Is there any opposition? Seeing none, thank you very much. We have accepted that. Are there any other bill introductions? Mr. Durst, please introduce yourself.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon. My name is Stephen Durst on behalf of Federico Durst Consulting Group and our client, ACE Scholarships. We'd respectfully ask introduction of a bill pertaining to low-income tax credits for scholarships. The RS number on this is 0446.
Committee, are there any questions? Senator Petty.
Is this expanding tax credits,
This
ability, use?
This would allow, free and reduced lunch, individual or students who are on free and reduced lunch to have access to scholarships and tax credits, yes. So it would expand it to a small universe.
So it's scholarships? Correct. Not, I mean, tax credits are for an organization, but is it scholarships or both?
Scholarships, you receive a tax credit when you donate to these scholarship programs, and then the dollars are given to students. Yep.
Thank you.
Committee, is there any opposition? Thank you. That's been accepted by committee. At this point in time, I will take a bit of personal privilege, and I want to thank our vice chair. I think all of you know by now that I was unable to be here last week because my husband had a heart attack. And I just want to thank the vice chair for stepping in so quickly and making sure that we were able to continue to meet and continue to do our work so that we can move forward for kids in Kansas and education in Kansas. So thank you so much. Yes, Senator Petty.
I was just wondering if you could give us that first RS number again.
Yes, on the Promise Scholarship, it is RS 0259.
And so that's for the Promise. And so is this still then for having a hearing on Monday, even though we're just getting the RS number?
It is.
But the bill is not available yet?
It will be available this evening. If it's read in, it will be given a number and it will be available. I actually have a copy of it, and so I will ask that the committee assistant email you the copy of that bill draft in the RS form.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Now, and just as I guess a bit of housekeeping, so when we have 2 days where the governor has asked us to have the Capitol closed, it's impossible to, one, have bills requested, have those read in to the Senate to be assigned bill numbers. So what we are trying to do is move things forward. We know that not all of our revisers were able to work as rapidly through some of these bills. I would simply say the Promise Act bill is not new. It had a hearing in the House. It had a hearing in the Senate. It then was passed out of the House and the Senate, and it went into conference committee when we went into emergency session. So it's been seen multiple times by both houses and voted on as well. So at this point, we are going to transition now to a briefing. We'll start with Heidi Zimmerman, our principal auditor. She is going to give us information on legislative post-audit report on evaluating at-risk student counts, weights, and expenditures. Heidi, thank you for being here.
There we go. All right. So just for a little bit of context at this audit, we actually conducted this audit in 2019. We presented it to this committee probably about this time last year. Senator Baumgardner asked me to come present it again, just as a refresher for some of the issues that we noted last year. So first of all, this is a 3-question audit. It's looking at how at-risk funding compares to district spending, whether the Department of Education calculated at-risk funding correctly, and how the state's method of funding at-risk compares to other methods. So first of all, just a really short, brief answer. I will give you a longer answer, but the short answer is that districts spend more on at-risk services than they received in funding. The department calculated at-risk funding correctly, although we noted a number of other concerns with the department. And stakeholders generally thought the way the state funds at-risk was generally reasonable. So on page 3, There's just a little bit of background information first about how the state funds at risk. So first of all, districts receive additional state funding to help students who are at risk of academic failure. This at-risk funding is based on the number of students in the district who are eligible for a free lunch through the National School Lunch Program. At-risk funding is calculated using a weighting. The number of eligible students, so the number of students who receive a free lunch in the district, is multiplied by a weight of 0.484. That number is multiplied by the base. In 2018-19, the state provided at-risk funding for all districts totaling $362 million. The state also provides an additional funding to districts that have more than 35% of their kids receiving free lunch. This is called high-density at-risk funding. The state provided about $50 million in high-density at-risk funding. When I talk through this audit, high-density and at-risk funding, I'm just going to refer to as at-risk funding. But total, between those two funding streams, the state provided $413 million in at-risk funding in the 2019 school year. So now for the detailed answer to the audit questions. We chose 20 of the state's 286 school districts to review. We chose these districts for variety in size and location and the percentage of students receiving free lunch. These districts represent about 30% of the state's total at-risk funding. We cannot project the results, though, to all school districts because we did not choose them randomly. But we worked with these selected districts to identify their at-risk expenditures. So on page 4, the first figure there shows the 20 districts, how much at-risk funding they received and how much they spent in the 19 school year. So those 20 districts reported spending nearly $162 million on at-risk services. And overall, state at-risk funding covered 77% of those 20 districts' spending. We also noted that most districts serve more students than they received state funding for because funding is not tied to services. So as I mentioned earlier, the number of students eligible for a free lunch determines how much funding a district receives. But the districts determine which students will receive at-risk services, and they consider more factors than just poverty. Oftentimes, they consider attendance and academic performance and a student's social and emotional needs when determining whether a student is at risk. Look on page 6, the figure 2, again shows our 20 districts, the number of students that were funded and the number of students served. And as you can see that overall, the school districts provided services to 16% more students than they received funding for. We also reviewed how districts spent their at-risk funding. So of the $162 million those 20 districts reported spending, 96% was for staff salaries and benefits. So we looked to see who those staff were, and of the 4,000 staff districts reported to us, 91% were classroom teachers or paras. Additionally, 19 of the 20 districts used at-risk funds to pay for regular classroom teachers. This includes core teachers who teach things like math and science. But most districts also reported using at-risk funds to pay for teachers who teach elective courses, such as band and PE. Most of the at-risk funding we reviewed was spent on teachers and programs, though, that serve all students, rather than focusing spending on at-risk students. Based on state statute and Department of Education documents, at-risk funding is meant to provide at-risk students with additional educational opportunities and services. The department provides guidance to school districts that tells them that these services should be above and beyond what is offered to all students. As noted before, most at-risk funds were for regular classroom teacher salaries. The Department of Education does not require teachers to track the amount of time they spend providing services to at-risk students. Instead, the department allows districts to use at-risk funds to pay teacher salaries in the proportion to the number of at-risk students in the building. We also reviewed some of the programs and practices that districts told us they were using to determine whether those practices and programs were designed to effectively meet the needs of at-risk students. We found that only 9 of the 29 programs we reviewed were designed specifically for at-risk students. Further, only 3 were proven to be effective. Next, we also reviewed at-risk expenditures to determine if they were directly related to at-risk programs. And the results from this work are not projectable to all spending because, again, we didn't choose randomly. Figure 5, which is on page 11, shows the expenditures made using at-risk funds that were not directly related to at-risk programs or practices. As that figure shows, about $191,000, or only about 4% of all the expenditures we looked at in at-risk spending, was not related to at-risk programs. Next, I'm going to change gears a little bit and talk a little bit about the Kansas Department of Education's oversight of this program. State statute directs the State Board of Education to identify and approve evidence-based practices for at-risk programs and for the instruction of at-risk students. The department staff compiles these practices and programs, and they maintain a web page that includes the approved practices. We reviewed the programs and practices that the board had approved and that are on the website to make sure they complied with the 2 criteria in state law. So that first criteria is that the first criteria requires that approved practices be for at-risk programs and for the instruction of at-risk students. The second requires that those programs and practices be evidence-based. Most of the approved practices and programs are not related to at-risk programs or at-risk students as required by state law. Instead, many of the items appear to just be good practices or resources for teaching generally. Department staff also could not produce research to show that the approved items were in fact evidence-based. We also looked at the guidance documents that the department provides to school districts. In the past, state law did not provide much information to school districts on the specific ways they could or could not spend their at-risk funding. To address this, the department provided guidance to districts to give them some direction on how they could spend their funding. However, the legislature implemented new spending rules starting with the 2019 school year. Beginning that year, districts are only allowed to spend at-risk funding on programs or practices the board has approved. Districts can also spend at-risk funding on the educational personnel and the contracted services related to those approved programs. Department staff continued to provide guidance to school districts, but it did not update that guidance to reflect the new spending requirements. Department staff, though, told us they provided the correct information to districts in annual trainings that they hold with them. Nevertheless, many districts did not seem to understand that they could spend at-risk funding only on the programs and practices the board has approved. Some districts indicated to us they could spend them on any evidence-based practice. Other districts reported spending funding for programs or practices approved for other programs, such as federal programs or other state programs like virtual schools. Districts likely spend most of their at-risk funding on regular classroom teachers because department guidance tells them they can do that. Department allows districts to pay regular classroom teachers in the same percentage of at-risk students in the building. However, it is not clear that this meets the purpose of at-risk funding based on what is laid out in state law. The last section of the report starts on page 15. And we looked at other criteria that the state could base at-risk funding on. We also collected some opinions from others about the way the state currently funds at-risk. First of all, we reviewed an Education Commission of the States report, and that report found that 43 states provide some type of at-risk funding. Of those 43 states, 38 base their at-risk funding on some measure of poverty. The most common was eligibility for free or reduced lunch participation in the National School Lunch Program. However, most other states base it on free and reduced lunch counts. Here in Kansas, we only base it on free counts. We also talked to a number of stakeholders, like school districts and various school district associations, to gather their opinions. Stakeholders generally thought that using a free lunch count was a good measure. However, they did note that a free lunch count might understate the number of at-risk students because the free lunch count does not capture students who may be at risk but not in poverty. Stakeholders also mentioned basing funding on the poverty counts from the U.S. Census, but they also noted it has some flaws. So most significantly, certain students who are most likely to be at risk, like migrant students, are often not included in the census count. Stakeholders also said that using academic measures, such as state assessments, could have problems. They noted that doing so often results in reduced funding as students' academic outcomes improve. Students may still need support to continue to succeed, but the district might not have the money available to continue to provide that support. So to conclude, the state's at-risk funding is intended to provide additional services to students who are not performing adequately in school. At-risk is provided by the state to the school districts to help them offer these additional programs or services to help these students succeed. However, the state's requirement that at-risk funding be spent on evidence-based practices for at-risk students has been poorly managed at the state level and has not been adequately implemented at the district level. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Committee, I believe you probably have some questions. Heidi, thank you for that presentation so far. So let's start getting into questions. Senator Gossage.
So if we see $190,000 were used for other expenditures as opposed to primarily at-risk students, what hand slapping or what, if anything, happened with these districts that use these funds inappropriately?
To my knowledge, largely nothing. We did point them out to the school districts, but we don't have any authority to make them do anything just because we pointed out. Now, the department sometimes, they told us that if they become aware, or they note that a school district has spent an at-risk fund or a bilingual fund or any kind of fund inappropriately, they will often let the school district know and ask the school district to reassign it to a different funding type. For these particular $190,000, unless the department came back and told them you need to do something different, then likely nothing happened.
Thank you.
Other questions? Sorry, Senator Petty.
Thank you. I noticed that you mentioned what the legislature did in 2019 concerning the at-risk funding, and that the state board had it, if I understood this correctly, because I'm sorry, I wasn't being able to find the right location on my computer. I need another tutorial on this part. It had to approve the programming, that it was evidence-based. Is this correct?
Yes, the statute directs the State Board of Education to identify and approve evidence-based practices for at-risk programs and for the instruction of at-risk students.
And just to clarify, that was in the 2019 session.
It first applied to the 2019 school year. I believe it was passed earlier than that. 2019 was the first year. That
Okay, thank you. I wanted you to clarify, because I was trying to think, if it was passed in 2019, then that makes a difference than if it was applied in 2019.
It was first applied in
2019 was the first year that directions went out to school districts for a change. And earlier, Madam Chair,
Yes.
earlier you said that only 9 of the 25 programs that were being used were evidence-based. Is that correct? Did
9 programs were specifically designed for at-risk students. 3 programs were found to be effective.
so that's where I was leading to. So what were you basing what you call effective?
We used what's called the What Works Clearinghouse. It's a federal website. It's operated by the Federal Department of Education, and they accumulate data and research on hundreds of different programs and practices that schools use. And they go out and they look at all the research that's available. They decide which program or which studies are of high enough quality to be included in their summary, and they determine this program is effective, or this program might be potentially effective, or this program may not be effective at all. And so we simply used the designations that came from the What Works Clearinghouse.
Okay, and so I'm going to assume then that using the information that's you've just given us about the only three from the What Works Clearinghouse were proven effective specifically for at-risk, that then in 2019, that was the first school year when districts had that legislation come into place, specifically speaking to what is a evidence-based at-risk program. Would this be correct?
2019 was the first year that they were required to spend their money only on the things, on the evidence-based practices or programs that the board approved.
The State Board of Education. Up until that time, all of the programs are being approved by the locally elected, approved school district boards, correct?
Correct. Until that point, the school districts made their own decisions about what programs or practices they wanted to implement to their at-risk population. The state statute was simply silent, largely, on how they could spend their at-risk funding until that point. The department gave them some guidance and some parameters, but when it came to the specific programs and practices, it was the local districts making those decisions.
Thank you.
Yes, Senator Dietrich and then Senator Sykes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So have you noticed some improvements or changes in the way the State Board of Education is approving these programs now? I think there was some discussion last year on that in a different committee.
We have not done a follow-up audit. We have not been asked to do a follow-up audit on this, so we have not done any follow-up work. I took a quick look today at the website that we referred to in this, and it was largely unchanged from last year.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Senator Sykes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for being here, Heidi. When you use the What Works Clearinghouse, how often is that one updated?
Based on when we looked at it, it looks like they're reviewing things pretty regularly. They seem to have at least some programs on some sort of rotation, so you can come in and see. In some cases, they've looked very recently. So you might see research from 2019, which would indicate they've been looking very recently. In other cases, it might be a few years old. That could indicate that there is just no new research, or it could indicate they haven't gotten around to updating that particular program.
Okay, thank you. I was curious because I think we all agree that JAG has been very appropriate in Kansas with helping at-risk students, and I know it has not been listed on that website, so just curious, but thank you.
Any other questions, committee? Senator Petty.
Just one follow-up. You mentioned towards the end about the staff working with at-risk students. And so I thought I heard, were you implying that a regular classroom teacher, there's a parents that they would not be able to work with at-risk students? I'm not sure I quite understood that.
No, the way the statute is written is both somewhat narrow and somewhat broad. It says you can only spend money on things that have been approved by the board. So best practices have been approved by the board. If a teacher was implementing those best practices in the classroom, was using those programs or practices in the classroom, then potentially that would be okay. The statute specifically says educational personnel related to these programs and practices is fine. You can use the money for that. What we saw when we looked is we saw a lot of money being spent on regular education classroom teachers with no assurance that they were doing things in the classroom that were on that approved list. So it's that approved list that is the gate for everything. Once a teacher starts doing those things, using at-risk funds to pay for that teacher, according to state law, looks like it should be okay. We just didn't see teachers doing those things. We're not sitting in the classroom. Neither is the Department of Education, though. And so our concern was they're approving these things without any assurance that the programs and practices happening in the classroom are things that have been approved by the state board, which must happen for them to spend that money.
Senator Erickson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Heidi, for being here and for your presentation. A couple of quick questions. So just so I'm tracking, the funding mechanism is not tied directly to the students who are to benefit from the funding necessarily?
Correct.
Correct. Okay, what is the definition then of an at-risk student according to the state of Kansas?
State of Kansas, back up. In terms of funding, an at-risk at-risk funding is based on a student who receives a free lunch. So if a student is eligible to receive a free lunch, they are eligible for at-risk funding. When you talk about at-risk in terms of how the districts view at-risk and what students they deliver services to, that's a much broader definition. And the Department of Education does provide some information to districts about, here are the kinds of things that might make a student at risk. And that can be things like living in poverty. It can be being a child in need of care, being in foster care, having social or emotional needs, having behavior issues. They have, I want to say, around 12 or so different points or kind of criteria that school districts can use to identify a student as being at risk and then deliver services to that student.
Follow up, if I may, Madam Chair. So a district gets to determine that. And is it fair to say that a student who's identified at risk in one district may not meet the criteria or the subjective opinion of another district? And if so, how do the teachers who are getting the funding to provide those services, how do they know which students in their classroom are classified as at risk according to the district definition? Thank you.
First of all, yes, it is possible for a student who is viewed as at risk in one school district to not be considered at risk in another. Although across the 20 districts, when we went and talked to those districts, we asked them, tell us what your criteria is for an at-risk student. And across the districts we looked at, there was a fair amount of commonality in terms of what they considered at risk. Nevertheless, there is certainly some aspects of it are subjective in terms of you have behavior problems that rise to a level of being at risk. One district might think so, another district might not. In terms of how teachers know,
I will answer that.
that gets a little more, go ahead.
I will answer that. In testimony, what we heard is primarily if the school was kindergarten through 5th grade, teachers knew which students were lagging behind. But what we heard in testimony from counselors as well as special education teachers, as well as general education teachers, when they hit middle school and high school, individual instructors did not know which kids fell into any of that category. Let's see, next up I have Senator Straub.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I know you spoke about the evidence-based programs for the criteria for at-risk funding. I know that being a virtual homeschool parent, that there's a thing called DIBELS testing, Dynamic Indicators of Basic Early Literacy Skills, and why doesn't the state use programs like that to identify at-risk students rather than just using income-based criteria? I come from a family of 6 children and somehow graduated valedictorian of my high school class.
School districts do,
I think we need to make sure there's a distinction. What qualifies for the funding that goes to the school district is whether a child is eligible for free or reduced funding. That's how it's measured for the money to go to the school district. It is not an indication that a child is an at-risk child. That is simply how they measure the funding that is to go to the district.
many school districts do use DIBELS and MAP and AIMSweb and a whole variety of programs to assess their students and make sure they're making adequate progress, and they use those to identify students who are struggling. So those are being used. That's not the criteria for getting funding. We talked to schools about what would happen if we did use some sort of assessment, some sort of academic assessment to say, these kids are at risk because their assessments are lagging behind. School districts were a little concerned about that because they were concerned that that money will only be there so long as kids are struggling. You give them good services, they get better, they get on track, the funding goes away, but they might still need services to maintain that success, but the funding is gone.
Quickly, and then Senator Dietrich, we do have another presenter that we need to get to.
One quick follow-up. I believe that there is scientific-based research that shows that a child's class ranking is pretty much set by age 9, or essentially 3rd grade. So I think it is kind of fair to say that if we're using early childhood ed scores in identifying at-risk students, that kind of trends then later on through their school years. So just something to think about.
Thank you. Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This ties back to that question of general education teachers receiving funding. So think back to when some districts were implementing full-day kindergarten. And so, they were being funded at a 0.5 for half-day kindergarten, but yet they used the at-risk funds to keep the kids in school for a full day. That's my conundrum when we're talking about, that's going above and beyond, but it's a regular education teacher in the classroom with all students.
Back when that was occurring, the Department of Education, of course, said that was fine. There was nothing in statute that said that it wasn't. In fact, I think statute may have even said that it was okay to do that.
It was allowed.
So that was allowed. That's a little different. That's a little different now. I think that probably gets to a little bit of legislative intent in terms of what it is that you want to see these districts do with that money. Kind of a policy issue that's up to you guys.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And just to be clear, it was at the same time of evidence-based. That requirement was put in at the same time that we changed kindergarten from 0.5 to 1.0. So those two changes occurred in tandem. That is all the questions we have. Thank you so much. We may call on you in future. At this time, it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Blake Flanders, President and CEO of the Kansas Board of Regents. I do apologize. We had questions, and we're going to give you ample time to present, but I do appreciate that you've already kind of reduced your presentation, knowing that there were two.
Sure, and thank you, Chair Baumgartner, members of the committee. What I will do is be just pretty high level, leave you with the material. If you have questions, just contact me or contact Matt Casey, and we'll certainly try to answer those. I know that our time is short. Again, I'm Blake Flanders. I'm President and CEO of the Kansas Board of Regents, and we were asked to talk a little bit about the Board of Regents, structure, and our institutions, and also about some of the pandemic's impact on our system. And then I hope to return soon to talk about our strategic plan and some of the work that we have going on with our future Council of Higher Education that involve not only legislators, but also board members, trustees from community colleges, and directors of technical colleges. So just in terms of the Board of Regents, by state law, we have a 9-member board. 5 of the 9 members may be from one political party. And I've listed who those board members are on the first page. I didn't know exactly how much mic to use because sometimes I can hear some feedback. So thank you, Matt. So on the first page, I've listed our board members, current board members. We have our strategic plan we just built is called Building a Future. It has 3 pillars, and we really had a different focus on this strategic plan. Our strategic plan is not as much about building up institutions as it is about what the institutions can do for Kansans. And so we've addressed how we're going to help Kansas families, how we're going to help Kansas businesses, and build economic prosperity for our state. We also have goals every year, and I've listed those, and those goals are a little more nuanced and narrow than the broad strategic plan. Academic program transfer is very important to us. We're reviewing low enrollment programs at our institutions. We know that we need belt tightening in these times. We would like to offer as broad an offering as possible. I will tell you that every program has a constituency, okay? And so as you go to eliminate programs, it's very difficult. We'd like to offer as many as possible. We know in this kind of time, we have to narrow our offering. We look at how can we make tuition rates very transparent and for all, because we know that aids in degree completion. And then we do have an issue with deferred maintenance. I have a slide that talks about the amount of facilities that we have. And, you know, many of our campuses are old and they're state buildings. They have not been invested in terms of what those deferred maintenance needs are. And we will be developing a plan to help mitigate some of that deferred maintenance. We also are developing board guidance on free speech. And so that will be done this year and that pertains to our students. We already have guidance if you're an employee, but you know, how do we handle free speech on our campuses? How do we ensure that we have really a civil dialogue and a civil debate? And how do we make sure that all voices have an opportunity to be heard on the campus? So structurally, we have public higher education underneath the Board of Regents, and that really happened in Senate Bill 345. The colleges that are not underneath the board would be the independent colleges, and you might have heard from Matt Lindsay before, and so those institutions, many of them around the Kansas City area and up and down the I-35 corridor, typically affiliated, have roots in a church, you know, so those are independent. Matt Lindsay likes to tell me our I is for independent. We want to stay independent, and we're fine with that. We work closely with the independent colleges in terms of sharing data. We do govern the 6 state universities. We coordinate all of the universities, a municipal university, which is Washburn, and the community colleges, 19 community colleges and 6 technical colleges. So those coordinated institutions would not have a single board of regents. They have their own board, but there's coordinating functions. And we've listed some of those. We approve programs. We approve the state funding for those institutions. We also regulate the for-profit institutions. Those would be more like Phoenix, not the independent colleges, but you've heard of Phoenix University and some of those for-profit universities. We regulate those. There's a specific criteria. We actually had legislation to change some of that last year. It was popular legislation, I believe, passed the committee, got hung up when the session went the way it did, and so we'll be bringing that back again. I've listed just the names of the colleges there and won't go ahead and read all of those. You know, coordination, that role of coordination is always hotly debated. When does coordination leak into governance? How independent should a coordinated institution be? You know, it's really laid out in statute. It's always how you read that, though. But we develop a unified budget for higher education. We represent the system before you and the governor. And one of the biggest pieces of the coordination is we collect the data. So I would just encourage you, I won't go through all my slides today based on time, but I'd encourage you, we have a very transparent website where you can find any data you want through our portal. Or one other way is to call me, and we will get you any report. You can really, we have tremendous amounts of data on each program, the outcomes of each program, and our students here in the higher education system. Now, I was also asked to, before I go on with the PowerPoint, was asked to talk about the effect of the pandemic on our system. I've attached, in one of the attachments, we have some of the university's responses with staffing. I'd like to just go back to the beginning of the pandemic. So I received a call from a university leader a few days before our spring break was ending last year and said, we're concerned about bringing students back from spring break. If you remember back, this is just first when the pandemic was beginning. And our board said, we will go online for the remainder of this semester because we have students all over the United States and sometimes even in other countries. And we didn't want to bring those all back to Kansas communities. So that was a heavy lift. We were the first ones in the state. And I will tell you, I think that action did save communities from bringing in much infection at the time. We were responsible for doing that. Then while the pandemic began to escalate, I was proud of all of our institutions. We had community colleges that got ventilators to the right people. We had nursing students doing all kinds of good work. We had the medical schools graduated slightly earlier and were able to put out into the workforce. So we really wanted to partner with the state to really assist as we moved along. I don't have to tell you the amount of revenue threats that we had. And not just threats, but actually headwinds. So, you know, there was refunds for residence halls. The board had to change their policy. Generally for auxiliaries, we do not allow any state general fund to go into auxiliaries. They have to stand on their own at universities. That's not true at community colleges. Each local board makes that decision. But, you know, candidly, we didn't have, those are based on people actually living there and paying. And so we had all those refunds that we needed to give. We have gotten some federal help in that area. We appreciate that. We also, you know, the athletics at our larger institutions are separate corporations, but you can just imagine one thing to really that characterizes the revenue threats is go to a basketball game in Allen Fieldhouse right now, or a sporting event somewhere, and you'll see that generally there might have been 18,000 fans there. There's 3,000 fans. So you can see kind of how those revenue threats are. That is not just in athletics. The campuses were essentially shut down for the summer. We have multiple events that go on campus in the summer, and some of those events, people pay to use those facilities. And so the revenue threats have been very real. But, you know, we are going to get through this. I will tell you the board just yesterday did pass a policy for our state universities that are going to allow greater flexibility if layoffs and if staff reductions are needed. We are in a time when we know that the current budget that's going to be debated has our funding, I think, about the same state general fund, no adjustments for inflation, but about the same as 2007, 2008, right in there, I believe, and our expenses go up. We're a heavy people business. And with that, if you think about the cost of health insurance and those types of things that we end up providing, we have additional costs. And the policy of the state has been to shrink this system. So we know we're going to need to shrink in terms of footprint, and we would like to do it strategically. If the current policy continues, we'd like to do that more strategically than just across the board cuts every time, where every program and every part of the university or college ends up getting hit. We have, it's clear that the COVID funding from the federal government has helped the institutions. But it is not a substitute. One-time money is not a substitute for a state generally funded budget. We have a spreadsheet with that. Would you like me to walk through the spreadsheet? If you have questions about the federal funding, I'd be glad to answer that. I think I will set that aside since
I think we will need to set that aside. And I think because of some of the bills that we have coming forward, I think we'll have an opportunity to revisit that, particularly with regard to, I know that next week we have several hearings and the week after we'll have some hearings. So committee, please keep that spreadsheet. You might ask your assistant to print that out so you can write questions on it and bring it in.
And so what we've listed there is the different funding streams, and then some of those went directly to students. So if you have questions about how that worked, just let me know. There was one funding stream, I just say that we call it the gear funding, where our state, and in fact, our state association says, how did higher ed receive all the gear funding? Well, that was actually where the governor did an allotment, put in the 26 million of gear funding, took out 26 million of state general fund. And so that was more of a in and out. So really the budget didn't increase. I will tell you the difference with federal funds too. The guidance is, we appreciate all the work that has to be done around guidance for funding, but the guidance is slower. Those resources are typically less flexible, and so they have to be spent on certain items. And so it is more cumbersome when you're dealing with federal funding than when you're dealing with dollars that are a little more flexible. I'll quickly go to the PowerPoint slides and then just go over a few of those, and then I'll stand for question. I've listed on page 3 the higher education institutions and some of that productivity, about 238,000 students enrolled, almost 44,000 credentials awarded. And we're interested in all types of credentials, whether it be a short-term welding certificate that enables someone to work in that industry, or whether it be a baccalaureate, master's, or a doctoral degree. We also, if you look at academic year enrollments for the system, you can see that the system's down. There's a couple of reasons for that. As you eliminate travel, much of our international students are down. And then we had a phenomenon with our coordination with the high schools. We deliver a tremendous amount of concurrent enrollment, and we found out how hard it is when the schedules are misaligned. So the high schools started later, we had started earlier, and you just, from a counseling perspective, you have less opportunity to get students in those college classes delivered in the junior and senior year. I think that's where a real part of growth needs to happen. I think we really need to blend those years. There's many students that are ready for college when they're a junior, senior in high school. Let's give them that opportunity. And we can do that right in the high school. I am pleased to report, this sounds like such a small thing, but it's big. We have a coordinating council with the Kansas State Department of Education, and now we have aligned spring breaks for next year. So the state university spring breaks are going to be the same as many of the school districts. I think we have most of the community colleges have aligned as well. And again, that sounds like a real small thing, but anytime you start moving calendars, it gets to be a big thing. Although we had to adjust our calendar pretty radically. And when you think about moving to online in 1 or 2 weeks, it's very difficult. But we know that for enrollments, and if you look at those preliminary enrollments of state universities, you can see that on page 5, community colleges and technical colleges, we have some troubling trends. Our state universities over the last 10 years, we are flat to down, I would say. I would make that trend just slightly down. And we've had a real drop at the community colleges. And I think probably they're serving more at-risk students. So here's what the current dynamic is. If you look at some data from Georgetown, I think they pulled from the census, and I don't have it all today, but I'll come back with it. Just kind of asking households, are you going to take more credit hours next year, less credit hours, or are you not going to go at all to college? Those numbers are troubling. Of the number of people that say I'm going to take fewer credit hours or I'm not going to go at all. And so we'll look at those data and see what they really mean for Kansas. But here's what we know when we went all online for a while. Now we're hybrid. Some institutions are more face-to-face, others have are kind of split. What we found out is our students, most of our students prefer face-to-face. And most students that have any difficulty with learning, face-to-face seems to be much better. It really does. And so my concern is that as districts have had to go fully online, connecting, it was interesting, you had the at-risk conversation right here, but connecting with students whose parents didn't go to college, or connecting with students who are from homes where college is going to be a heavier lift. You know, how do we help them complete the federal financial aid statements? How do we make sure that they're ready to go? And candidly, it's going to be difficult when it's a completely online environment. I know that people are doing the best they can with the current situation, but those are some significant headwinds that our institutions, I believe, are going to be facing. I would just tell you that higher ed is the answer for economic development and economic growth, though. If you look at page 8 on net migration, and you can look in the fall 2018 semester, and actually on page 7, I did it for 10 years earlier. But we're importing over 3,800 students come in that graduate high school. So higher ed is bringing talent to the state. So we have some students who leave the state and go to college in some other state. But we're net gaining there. Our challenge right now, and this is something that we're coordinating with the Department of Commerce, is that last mile. Once they graduate, let's make sure we have an opportunity for them here in Kansas. And as we've studied that, some of our students, our graduates, are earning quite a bit higher salaries in other states. And we have to make sure we're helping our Kansas businesses, that we're connecting those students to them while they're still here in college, in Kansas, giving them internships with those businesses, and making sure those career opportunities are the kind that those students want to stay. I think that's going to be one of the biggest things that we work on. It's part of what the board wants to do, and we have to keep more of our graduates here. We have, obviously, we have changing demographics. You all know this. Our communities, we're going to have more first-generation students, more Pell-eligible students, more racially diverse students. We're going to be doing more developmental education at the college level. We expect that will happen mostly at the community colleges. We're reforming how we do developmental education. We used to do it in a sequence. We now know that you need to do that maybe while the student's in the credit-bearing class. And so you'll see several of those recommendations, because on page 12, we see a troubling trend that we're serving a lower percentage of Pell-eligible students. And so that is a troubling trend, because that's not going to allow people to advance to the middle class. I put some things in student debt in the presentation, some other data that you might be interested with in finances, how we're funded. I would, at this point, stand for questions.
Actually, we are out of time, so WebEx is going to cut us off. The committee, we will circle back around. We will, if you send Cindy, our committee assistant, if you send her specific questions that you have, we will get those to Dr. Flanders. He will get a response to us, but we will be seeing him next week. I know. Thank you much. Our committee meeting is adjourned.